Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony Blanc, and today I'm in conversation with David Earl, who was my inspiration to set up Tony at 12. Today, we're going to take a look at the possibility of extending the Alderney runway and introducing ATR aircraft. David, good to see you. Thanks for sparing me some time.
Good morning, Tony, or should I say Mr. White? I always called you.
I know, AKA. Now, we've obviously got some viewers that live on the mainland, don't live in Alderney. So first of all, can you sort of give us a brief description of the current airfield in terms of the runway dimensions?
Well, I believe Alderney Airport was one of the first, if not the first runway in the Channel Islands. It consists of 3 runways. Originally they were grass, but the main runway, which is 0826, in other words, it runs roughly easterly in one direction and westerly in the other direction. That was paved some years ago, quite a long time ago. The date escapes me at the moment, but basically it's the length of the runway is 887 meters long, but that has been effectively reduced so that the declared length is now only 800 meters. And the reason for that is quite simple. The runway itself is only 18 meters wide, and legally it should be 23 meters wide. Now, for a long time, we got away with it on the basis there are a couple of strips of grass each side, which were included in the overall width, but that is no longer the case. So back in, was it 2019, the states of Guernsey agreed to pay £11 million to rehabilitate the runway and widen it to 23 meters, which would make it legal.
So currently we're operating under what they call a derogation from the CAA, and derogation by definition is a temporary arrangement, isn't it?
Well, that's absolutely right. I think the patience of the CAA will very soon get tested, because this has been the case for some years now. Obviously, we've had the big C interfere with everything and basically slow things down. But at some point, the states of Guernsey are going to have to bite the bullet. And basically, what they're doing at the moment is looking at 2 options. I'm not sure they're not just kicking the ball into the long grass, but they are looking at 2 options. One is to do what they said they'd do a couple of years ago, and the other one is to extend the runway so that they can land ATR 72 aircraft here in Alderney.
So to do that, you need to extend the runway by how much?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Let's look at a year ago, I did some research, quite extensive research into the options. The one option is to extend the runway to 1,000 meters. Now, the big advantage of that is that we could have Medivac aircraft operating into Alderney 24/7. We wouldn't be reliant on Aurigny, but we would be reliant on a company, probably a company called Gamma Aviation, who operate the Medivac services for both Jersey and Guernsey. But they are expensive, and I'm not going to quote figures, but mouth-watering figures I've heard. So that's option number 1. According to ATR, that's the company that make the ATR 72, that the aircraft could land in a distance of around, I'm going to say around because I've heard different figures, of around 1,100 meters, okay? But to operate the ATR normally, you would need at least 1,400 meters, plus something called, I have to look at my notes here, it's an RESA, which is a runway extension safety area. And that would be another, maybe say another 100, 120 meters on top of that each end. Now, it wouldn't be a formal runway, but it's basically a runoff area. If you remember a few years ago, we had a Trilander overshoot the airport. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. There was a grass runoff area. but grass is slippery, particularly when it's wet. So basically, this runoff area would have to be of a suitable material, not necessarily the same material as the runway. So basically, going back to what we need for an ATR, at the moment, we don't have anything because it's illegal. But the original concept, which is to extend the runway to well, it's not extend the runway, but widen the runway, that would make it Code B compliant. Now, there are different flavors of ATRs. The ATR 72 is the latest one. ATR 72-600 is the one that Alderney have, and that basically requires a Code 3C category runway. Now, that is around 1,400 meters, but ATR say they can land within 1,100 meters. But the problem is that they're talking about a 23-meter wide runway and not a 30-meter wide runway, which is what you need to comply with category 3C. Now, basically, what we're looking at is a slightly smaller version of the runway at Guernsey. You know, maybe the authorities would allow the ATR to land on a runway of, say, 1,100 meters by 23 meters. But the problem is that would be fine on a sunny day with the wind straight down the runway. But we don't have that kind of weather every day, unfortunately. I wish we did. The second you get crosswinds, and one of the interesting thing is the runway we have, the same as in Guernsey, is roughly orientated east-west. And that means that was where the prevailing winds were. Now, you asked me where the prevailing winds were, and we've had some pretty strong winds from the north, pretty strong winds from the south. You know, they're crosswinds, and that disrupts, you know, our flights to and from Guernsey and indeed Southampton. So, you know, unless you have a wide enough runway, you don't have the margin for error. And it's the same with the runoff areas at the end.
So you then I'll ask yourself, what's the point? So if you went for the increased length runway wise, just to get this straight, you'd really need to take it out to 30 meters to make it really functional, would you?
Basically, the law, and we come under civil aviation law for this, well, you basically come under two authorities. We've got the CAA, UK CAA, and the Director of Civil Aviation in Guernsey. And basically, the Guernsey adopt the UK specifications, which is 3C, code 3C, and we would be back to a derogation or an exemption to allow the aircraft to operate with a 23-meter wide runway. And I think you'd find that they would say, well, you know, there's a maximum crosswind limit, or you can't do it when it's ret, or there's an R in the month. Yeah.
So you don't achieve too much there. How much is this likely to cost, David, in terms of the actual runway itself, if they go for the extension?
There was a report from York Aviation which was produced on behalf of both the states of Guernsey and the states of Alderney. And if I remember rightly, they were looking at 20 to 30 million to extend the runway to the sort of distance we're looking at.
It's quite a bit of money to find, isn't it, from that point of view?
That's York Aviation figures, not mine.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. But and you can probably sort of chuck in a bit more for inflation and everything else.
Well, that was 3 years ago.
Yeah,
so yes.
That's right. Yeah, so I mean that would have changed things quite a bit. Now, let's go on to Alderney themselves, because once again, you know, to inform our non-Alderney viewers, the company is owned by the states of Guernsey. Brief background as to how a government ends up acquiring an airline, David.
Well, basically, Aurigny was, I believe, in financial straits, but that may not be the case, in which case I apologize. But I can't remember how long. It must be 10, 12 years ago. The States of Guernsey basically took over the ownership of Aurigny and I believe Anglo-Normandy Aero Engineering.
But the thing that triggered it, as much as anything, disregarding the financial aspect, was the fact that they wanted to retain these slots at Gatwick Airport, wasn't it?
That was different. That came later. But
oh,
yes.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, that's really why they've wanted to hang on to it in the way that they have. Now, from that point of view, they're now saying that they would like to operate a single type airliner, and we're talking here ATR 72s. They get rid of the Dornier. So the question next is, what about their jet? What happens to that?
Well, the jet is entirely separate. They bought the jet when Flybe pulled out of Gatwick because they felt that they needed a jet. I'm told the main reason was capacity, because the jet has a larger capacity than the ATR. I think it's about twice. I can't remember how many seats the Embraer 95
it's well
has.
over 100, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's 120, 130, something like that. So it's twice the ATR. So that's why they went for the jet. It's irrelevant to this conversation. I mean, you know, really the logic behind this runway extension and using the ATR 72 to operate the Alderney routes, as they like to call them, the logic is quite straightforward. You know, you've only got to look at Ryanair, and indeed more locally Blue Islands. You know, they operate a single type of aircraft. A pilot or crew can get out of one aircraft, go down the steps, climb up the steps into the one next door. Doesn't matter how old it is or anything, but they can fly it. You know, here you have to have three different kinds of crews, one for the jet, one for the ATR, and one for the Dornier. So, you know, that makes it expensive, you know, and you've got maintenance costs and everything else. So in an ideal world, a single type airline is the perfect scenario. But, you know, we're talking about Alderney here. Alderney has an 887 meter runway, which is not suitable for ATRs, and whether the island is suitable for ATRs is questionable, but that's not my decision.
Okay, from a technical point of view, if they were able to bring an ATR in on the basis of an extended runway, there would still be restrictions in terms of passenger numbers. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. I think you know, one of the comments that people make is, oh, it'd be wonderful, we could bring in hundreds of people, it would revolutionize the economy. But the truth is that Aurigny would probably be limited to operating it half full. So instead of 72 seats, I can't remember exactly the exact figure, they'd be looking at sort of around between 30 and 40 seats, maybe more on a good day, less on a bad day. But we're talking about a half full aircraft.
So have we any idea what the break-even point is in terms of numbers of passengers carried to make a service with an ATR viable? Because with a lot of airlines, it's got to be, what, 60 to 70%, hasn't it?
No, I would think that was a reasonable figure. I mean, Aurigny are the only people that can answer that question.
Yeah, but you know, it does sort of make you wonder whether or not anyone's actually considered that aspect of it. We're currently propped up with, what, a £2 million a year subsidy from Guernsey to run the services into Alderney. Presumably that would still apply.
That's a question I can't answer. You know, there is so much disinformation flying around that I'd prefer not to answer that question.
Okay, next one then. Fewer flights because of the fact the plane's bigger. So we could end up with one a day to Guernsey, one a day to Southampton, something like that.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the worst case scenario. Well, perhaps not even the worst case scenario. You're looking there are a number of problems. I think Alderney currently have 3 ATR 600s. I think the other one went. The 500 series one went. So basically, what you have to do is ask yourself how they use those aircrafts. Well, the jet covers the Gatwick route most of the time when it's not going off to Mallorca and other places to do trips to the sun. But Alderney operates quite a comprehensive series of routes to different destinations in the UK and increasingly in Europe. Now, most of those flights go in the morning and most of them come back in the evening. So, if you have sat in Guernsey Airport for an extended period, which I'm sure you have, you'll have noticed that. So, the question is, when are they going to operate the Alderney services using just 3 ATR 72s? Well, they could buy more ATR 72s, or maybe we will end up with our 1 or 2 rotations a day, because certainly aren't going to be many more at some time in the middle of the day. So you may lose the early morning flights and the afternoon flights. I'm speculating here, Tony.
Yeah, sure.
I haven't considered this, but you've only got to look at the facts. So unless they expand the number of aircraft or come up with some super plan, we are going to end up, with less services and at probably not convenient times.
But to justify additional aircraft, you've got to be sure you're going to get the revenue in to support it, haven't you?
Absolutely.
So I mean, that's a big question mark. Now, we've talked about crosswind capability, and obviously that's very relevant here. One thing that we were told when they came in with these new ATRs, the current model, is that they could operate in fog better than the old one.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, yes. I don't suppose they spent the money to have the which is basic. All it is an infrared camera in the nose of the aircraft, which can see through fog, whereas a normal visual camera, like the ones I used to do interviews and things with, they can't. I'm not sure whether that has been approved by the CAA yet. When I last inquired, it hadn't. So I can't answer that question. But in theory, they can operate in, shall we say, lower operating conditions than without it. So at the moment, I was just going to say here, the limitation at the moment is, I think, for the Dornier, it's currently 400 feet. So if they can't see the runway when they reach 400 feet, they have to execute an overshoot after missed approach and go somewhere else.
Apart from fog, what about, is it called cloud base? Low cloud creates a problem.
Actually, there are a number of factors that determine if and when an aircraft can land. Fog, certainly. I mean, if you can't see, you can't fly. Even in Guernsey with an ILS and all the trimmings, if it's really foggy, they can't fly. The next one is crosswinds. At the moment, that is a limiting factor on the Dornier operations. And that really depends on the direction of the runway. If it's straight down the runway, there's no problem. In fact, strong winds straight down the runway are a good thing. But the more the wind veers off the runway to the point where it's 90 degrees to the runway, that will make the difference. So crosswinds, big problem. Fog, absolute problem. Wet runway, that's another problem. The landing requirements for a wet runway are significantly higher than for a dry runway. And then in addition to that, you've got things like icing. Yeah. I think that covers it pretty well.
Interestingly, last year we were flying to Southampton, and it was one of those days, David, when there was absolutely no wind at all, a wet runway, and the captain had to bump half the passengers. because
That's
he
right.
just wouldn't be able to stop the thing in the event of a malfunction. So it was an exceptional time. I can't remember ever traveling and having a windsock that was absolutely limp.
Yeah, well, the problem is that, you go from the sublime to ridiculous. A wind that is too strong is a problem, and a wind or no wind is equally a problem, because basically an aircraft has a landing speed, and it's relative to the airflow, not to the speed over the ground. So if you've got no wind, it is traveling probably, shall we say 20, 30 knots faster when it touches the runway than it would be if there was a 20-knot headwind.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Guernsey are talking about extending their runway to try and attract presumably the likes of EasyJet and Mr. O'Leary. Do you think if that were to happen, Alderney would be disadvantaged, or do you think Guernsey would insist that certain routes remain sacrosanct?
It depends on what the states of Guernsey, what their long-term plans for Alderney are. It has been suggested that the reason EasyJet didn't get an operating license or weren't permitted to operate was quite simply that it would be, I won't say unfair, but it would be highly competitive with Alderney, and obviously the financial burden on the states would, as likely or not, become much greater.
But we did see a contradiction to that, didn't we, a couple of years ago, when they gave Flybe a chunk of money to take on the Heathrow route from Guernsey for a while.
Yes, well, that's because they didn't have the facilities. I mean, if you bring up Blue Islands, it is quite incredible to me how Alderney managed to lose 75% of their inter-island route, and I'm talking about the Guernsey to Jersey route, in what was a relatively short period of time.
Yeah.
So it could happen very quickly. I mean, you've only got to look at what's happening in Jersey. Jersey brought in an open skies policy. They don't own an airline, so they can do that. It's a very different situation in Guernsey.
Yeah, they don't need any protection as such. Correct. So, I mean, I suppose the other thing is these days that in going back 40 years, Jersey, Guernsey, lots of business people using the planes to come across, almost a bus service running, hourly. But of course, we've now got Zoom, we've now got the internet, we've now got email. I think the necessity for the sort of numbers of business meetings that we used to have is a thing of the past. Forget COVID, it's no longer required. So once again, that cuts down on the amount of traffic that an airline can expect.
It's an interesting point, but I read a very interesting article yesterday to suggest that the conference business, where hundreds, if not thousands of people gather in one location, that business was almost annihilated by COVID, but it is coming back. And I suspect the reason is because people actually like to network. And it's, as effective Zoom is, and I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, the fact that we can do this interview over Zoom is just marvelous, but, there is nothing there's nothing that beats actually, being able to pump flesh, as they say. And and it's not so much sitting in the auditorium listening to people present presentations, but it's the time they spend in the bar afterwards where
where the business is done.
But the other thing is something you've got to bear in mind in Guernsey. One of the requirements for Guernsey, I think I'm right in saying this, but one of the requirements for Guernsey company law is that you have to meet in person once a year. So that's why they had those derogations, which allowed business people to fly into Guernsey during the lockdown for that very purpose.
Let's get back to the Alderney situation. Now, we've talked about the fact that the runway is going to cost a shed load of money, as people say these days. But of course, there are additional costs, aren't there? There's increased costs for security, possible new terminal building, scanners, and all the rest of it.
Oh, absolutely. In many ways, the runway extension is the easy bit. Well, I say it's the easy bit. It depends on how far you want to go. I mean, let's just finish the runway. You know, the obvious way is to extend the runway eastwards, but then, you know, you go into at the end of the runway, you've got this big valley, which you'd have to fill. I know Guernsey have been looking at extending the runway west in a westerly direction, which would obviously reduce the amount of hardcore they'd have to bring into the island to facilitate that. But yes, you're absolutely right. The runway is the easy part. If we forget the runway for the moment, whether it's going to be 1,000, 1,100, 1,400 meters, 23 meters wide, 30 meters wide, doesn't really matter. The next problem is the taxiway. It's illegal. It's too steep an angle, so you would have to build a new taxiway. The next problem is the ramp itself. You put an ATR on the ramp and you'll only get one, and there won't be any room for anything else. And it's quite possible that the weight loading of both the ramp and the taxiway will not meet the requirements. But, you know, they're small fry again in comparison to the next problem. The real problem comes with international regulations for aircraft that have more than 19 seats. Now, as you know, the Dornier has 19 seats. If it had 20 seats, it would be in an entirely different bracket to the one it's in now. You know, we wouldn't be able to operate in the same way as we do now. And basically, the second we move to more than 19 seats, and it doesn't matter whether the aircraft, you know, if it's a 72-seat aircraft that's only carrying 19 passengers, it doesn't matter. It's the size of the aircraft that matters. That is the crucial thing. So basically, we have to start, what we're going to end up with is an airport that is, shall we say, a smaller version of Guernsey, Jersey, or Southampton, you know, because you're going to have the same facilities. First of all, you need segregation of passengers. That's segregation of arriving passengers with incoming passengers. So you need, I can't see how they could do it with the existing terminal. You know, maybe they can build some more porter cabins, but that's not really the way to do it. And I'm not sure that would be acceptable anyway.
Yeah.
So basically, you've got this separation of passengers. The next problem is that the airport authorities are going to have to scan all whole baggage. The two people sort of checking your bags manually as you go to check in will be a thing of the past. You know, your bags will disappear in the same way as they do at Guernsey, and they will go through a electronic scanning device. That has to be in a separate building and have its own security requirements. The next thing is, when you board the aircraft, then I suspect you will need to have a boarding gate, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. But what you will need is for all the passengers and all their hand baggage to be scanned in exactly the same way as happens when you go through Guernsey or any other international airport. So that's, you know, the key to it. You know, it's you moving into a big boys world, and you need to comply with the regulations. We are known as dirty passengers, which is why when the love of my life went to Gatwick last night, she had to check in again at Guernsey and check her bags in again, because she's come from Alderney and she's the dirty passenger. She'd had a bath, but that's not important.
Hope she doesn't hear that one.
No, well, she's on a train on her way to central London as we speak, so I'm hoping she won't hear. No, I mean, she'd see the funny side of it anyway. So basically, that's got to happen. The one thing we would probably get away with is having the new 3D scanners, which they've had to install in Guernsey and all other major airports at a huge cost. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds for them. And the other thing is, it's been estimated, not my figures, but it comes from a very reliable source, that it's estimated that the cost of providing the security personnel for Alderney Airport would be in the region of around £500,000 a year.
And of course, presumably you'd have to upgrade the fire service as well.
Well, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, bearing in mind what I've said, you know, the obvious thing is to raise the terminal building to the ground, build a new terminal building, which probably mean you're going to have to knock down the fire station to make way for it. Anyway, it's past its sell-by date anyway, so it basically needs renovating. And while you're at it, you might as well do the control tower as well, because that's about to fall out. I'm just looking out the window. Yeah, it's still there.
It's good.
So that's the good news. And one final requirement, which I don't think would go down terribly well, is that you'd need I think it's 10 or 12 foot high chain link fence all the way around the airport.
All the way around it, yeah. So here's the equation. Cost of airport versus ATR savings.
Absolutely.
It doesn't, does it?
That's your words, not mine.
No, well, I'm prepared to say them. And so, you know, the next question is, if it were to happen, who's going to pay for it? Guernsey?
Well, and unless someone can come up with a private benefactor who has a lot of millions of pounds burning a hole in his or her pocket, yes. I mean, the answer is very simple. It's the States of Guernsey. And as you quite rightly said, it's what they have to decide is whether or not extending the runway and doing all the other things, because you can't do you can extend the runway, but it wouldn't make any difference. The only thing is we'd be able to have an ambulance service if we could afford it.
Yeah. How long do you think it would take if they did agree to proceed with it? It's going to be a long time, isn't it? You know, in terms of construction.
Well, just looking at, I mean, let's forget extending the runway at the moment. You know, looking at rehabilitating, that's their words, not mine, the existing runway and increasing width to 23 meters, you know, that was going to be a real problem because, you know, you're either going to get a situation where they can only work at night, which would allow the runway to be used during the day, but extends the time and in turn increases the cost.
Yeah, of course.
You could close the airport and provide an alternative means of transport, helicopter, ferry, you know, whatever you like. And a third option that's being suggested is that you actually sort of tear up the old runway and build another one alongside it and slightly realign it. I don't know.
Yeah. And you know, the question is, do those that are in power know? You know, I have my doubts from that point of view. I suppose really the other thing is, should an airline owned by government actually be calling the shots on something like this? Who knows?
I have heard so much disinformation about this runway extension and ATRs, and to be quite honest, everything to do with aviation. You know, there are very few people on this island that actually know what they're talking about, and I question sometimes whether there are many people in Guernsey that do.
Yeah.
There are, but
I mean, I suppose
at the moment this is being driven.
The alternative, I suppose, is just to sort of scrap that idea altogether and operate planes going to Guernsey, use Guernsey as a hub, you know, back to the old islanders and things like that.
Well, it's interesting, but the flights to Southampton started again. Where was it? June, something like that, beginning of June, and they were pretty busy for June, July, August, and probably into September. But the passenger numbers since then have not been good, and I would think that you talk about break even. I would think that the Southampton routes aren't necessarily profitable at the moment. So yes, you could be looking at something else. When I was on the States, I proposed an integrated transport policy, but I failed. And quite simply, it was looking at what the island needed in terms of communications. I'm talking about physical communications.
Yeah.
I'm talking about air communications. I'm talking about marine communication, but an impartial assessment of what the island needed. And I believe that if the island of Alderney, the States of Alderney, had commissioned such a report, and there was support from it, particularly from the hoteliers, I won't name names.
Yeah, sure.
But there was considerable support for this idea. But I think that if we put together such a document and jumped on a plane to Guernsey and presented that to the states of Guernsey, that it would do the island a great deal of good. They may not agree, but they would be oppressed that the island had actually tried to do something to help itself for once.
Yeah. You're absolutely right on that one, no doubt about that. Well, so we just watch this space, do we?
I can't offer any more. The last the last press release I saw, which came by email, was that they hope to present some proposals to us in February, which indeed starts tomorrow. And talking about that, it's the start of the Chinese New Year, and I think it's prosperity is the name of the game this year. It's the year of the tiger, isn't it? I may be wrong.
I'm not sure. Hopefully, from their point of view, it's the year of the snow, because they've got the Winter Olympics starting shortly, and they haven't got much snow apparently.
Well, they have machines now. They have machines
absolutely,
now.
Absolutely. They'll get around.
Nothing is real, Tony. You should know that.
David, it's been a great pleasure as ever to talk to you. Thank you so much for sparing me some of your time. Really appreciate what you've been able to give us a full insight into the background on all this. So many, many thanks.
It's my pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Won't be much.